August 17th, 1945. The old steamer Pugachev rumbles up to the quay in Wonsan, about a third of the way down the east coast of Korea. Young men stream off the ship, bags and rifles slung over shoulders. Each of them blends into the crowd, chatting with their comrades as they spread out into town. No one knows what the future holds for any of them, including one round-faced guerrilla leader known as Kim Il-sung. Today, as the sea laps at the dock, all of them are simply happy to be back in the home they've been fighting for, even if they don't really know what that home is like anymore. Hello, and welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 4, Cordelia. Today we are continuing our discussion of the different potential paths Korea could have taken after the surrender of the Empire of Japan in August 1945. Last week, we broke down the breakdown of the Allied plans for a trusteeship of Korea and the origins of its replacement, occupation and division. This week, we will focus on the third path for post-colonial Korea, independence, because it is the most interesting and most tragic of the three. We'll finish today by catching up with our old friends Ri and Kim as they make their way back to the peninsula. Today's episode is named after Cordelia, the third daughter of Shakespeare's King Lear, who was denied her inheritance in favor of her two sisters. Those two sisters are really the ones guilty of that which Cordelia was accused, but the king can do nothing about it as he no longer has control of his kingdom. Like most of my metaphors, it's not perfect, but it fits pretty well for Korea in August 1945. Like that of Cordelia, Korea's post-colonial story is a tragic one of a future not realized. Koreans had the opportunity for unified independence snatched away from them by the American-born and Soviet-accepted division and occupation. Korea was once again bound amidst 10 leopards, but I didn't want to use the same title twice. When Koreans, like most other Japanese subjects, first heard the voice of Emperor Hirohito on August 15, 1945, it took a minute to settle in that the Empire of Japan was surrendering to the Allies. The emperor never actually said the word surrender in his speech. The Japanese surrender was a long time coming, but that couldn't be seen from inside the empire. The suddenness of it all shocked most everyone in Japanese-controlled territory, including those administrators in Korea whose suspicions peaked just a few days before. Because of this, there was not a plan immediately in place for independence. There were a set of challenges facing those in charge. First, the decolonization of Korea was stated in the Cairo Declaration, and the Government General of Korea knew that. They would have to be replaced upon the surrender of the empire and could face reprisals from Koreans on the peninsula in the time between the statement of surrender and whenever the victors arrived to take control. It's not unusual, as it is a fear held by anyone who oppresses a group that has much larger numbers in their immediate vicinity, such as white enslavers in the antebellum American South or European colonizers in sub-Saharan Africa. That dual mind required oppressors to both denigrate those they oppressed while fearing their perceived proclivity for violence. Both are products of what is thought to be a superior mind, but in actuality reflect a genuine truth of the grim realities of colonialism. It is a method of personal control and justification and a product of a savior's complex. This dual mind also justified all the violence inflicted upon those that were oppressed, imprisoned, or otherwise maltreated because, as constructed in the colonizer's mind, those they ruled were both too simple to do anything to improve their situation and too violent to live in a quote-unquote civilized world. Second, the Japanese did not know what the Americans and Soviets had planned for Korea. Trusteeship was not formally announced at any of the Allied conferences, and division was not to be announced until August 17th, 2 days after the announcement of surrender and 8 days after the first formal conversations between Japanese and Korean leaders about handing over administration. Even with the announcement of division, it was not originally thought that division would remain in place for long for two reasons. One, it was framed as an order for Japanese forces to surrender to the Americans south of the 38th parallel and to the Soviets north of the 38th, with no mention of an extended occupation. Two, the order was first given by General MacArthur on August 17th, but not officially issued by Japanese General Headquarters until after the formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd. In this 3-ish week period, something amazing happened. Koreans successfully governed themselves. The first known conversation between GGK officials and Korean leaders occurred on August 9th, the same day the United States dropped an atom bomb on Nagasaki, and just after the Soviets began pouring into Manchuria. A few GGK leaders met Song Jin-woo, a political activist, at a private residence to push Song to form an interim governing body. Song, if he accepted, would have access to all the communications and transportation systems controlled by GGK, but would inherit his legitimacy from GGK, and not from a mandate of the people. The Japanese went to Song because he was respected by Koreans and was expected to acquiesce to Japanese demands easily. According to Bruce Cummings, who I am again referencing in much of today's episode, Song turned down the offer for two reasons. He understood that any work done by Koreans after the Japanese surrender could just as easily be undone by the Allies once they arrived in Korea, and he believed the only legitimate Korean government was the Korean Provisional Government, founded in Shanghai in 1919, but having in the meantime moved with the capital of the Republic of China to Chongqing in south-central China. Song turned down the initial offer, and turned down the subsequent offers in the following days as GGK continued to reach out to him. After failing to get Song on board with the transition administration, GGK then went to Yo Un-young, another independence activist, with the same offer, just hours before Emperor Hirohito's address was broadcast. Yo stated he would only accept with 5 conditions: release of all political and economic prisoners, guaranteed food provisions for 3 months, no interference with Korean independence activities from here on out, no interference in Korean organizing activities for students and youth, and no interference in the training of workers and peasants. These demands were Yo's first steps in reunifying the country under an independent banner. Education and organization activities targeted at youth and workers would build 2 key base groups of a unified Korea, as was seen in many other revolutionary movements around the world before and since. The comprehensive release of prisoners would begin to heal some of the wounds inflicted on Koreans by the Japanese. Ensuring existing stores of food were not plundered and ensuring the food supply for at least 3 months removed one potential avenue for failure, as people can't do much if they're hungry. GGK begrudgingly agreed to these conditions, and Yo began the work of preparing for Korean independence. Why was GGK so keen on getting a Korean in charge of a transitional administration before the surrender was official? First, there was that fear I talked about earlier. There was still a good number of Japanese citizens living in Korea that could face reprisals from Koreans if liberation was declared without a system of protection in place. Second, the Soviets were getting closer and closer, making quick progress through Manchuria and into Korea. Even though division was agreed to on August 11th, the Japanese did not know about the arrangement and expected the Soviets to occupy the entire peninsula. Like other capitalist countries, Japan feared the Soviet Union and its massive Red Army much more than any other enemy. Third, they assumed that if they granted their legitimacy to the new Korean administration, their kindness would be reciprocated through an assurance of protection for Japanese interests and holdings. They would soon be very disappointed and unjustifiably surprised. Yo's first step was to call several other independence activists to his home to form the creatively named Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence, or CPKI. The Japanese wanted this new body to engage only in activities necessary to keep the peace, but Yo's conditions showed them that CPKI was not going to play by their rules. His compatriots that now made up CPKI were fully on board with this. Yo immediately had an aide draft a Korean Declaration of Independence, with specific clauses for democracy, the ouster of collaborators, and a welcome for exiles and emigres to return to Korea. Yo, like many other Koreans at the time, was distrustful of those who had collaborated in any way with the Japanese administration. Quoting directly from Cummings' Origins of the Korean War, in 1945, many Koreans worried that similar groups to the Il-Chin-ho, which was a group of pro-Japanese Koreans that pushed for annexation back in the early 1900s, might make an unprincipled alliance with a foreign power and thus frustrate Korean independence once again. CPKI quickly got down to the work of organizing a nationwide independence movement and administration. They did not want to just slide in at the top of the GGK hierarchy because they specifically wanted to draw their legitimacy from a mandate of the people, not from the legacy of the GGK, and certainly not as a gift from the Japanese. Parallel to the work of organizing, CPKI leaders spoke in public early and often about the importance of maintaining peace in the face of uncertainty. With the surrender of Japan official enough on August 16th, the first of Yo's demands were met. 16,000 political prisoners were released all at once, 10,000 alone in and around Seoul. These 16,000 formerly imprisoned persons quickly became involved in the work of CPKI, along with the 15,000 or so Korean soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army who were demobilized around the same time. CPKI's ranks swelled quickly as thousands of engaged Koreans became suddenly available for whatever CPKI needed. This was just one measure of the level of support for the committee. 145 branch committees were formed and working within the next 2 weeks. News of CPKI traveled quickly, it seems, and was almost universally well received by peasants and workers alike, although there was little direction of these groups coming from CPKI leadership. These were grassroots organizations with local support and goals alongside their support for CPKI. Conveniently enough for the Koreans, and inconveniently enough for the Japanese, the patriotic neighborhood associations that GGK required throughout the later years of the war provided the skeleton for local independence committees. Ironically, one of the main tools of Japanese oppression had quickly shifted to being a tool for independence. Even though CPKI was able to make itself known across Korea, the Japanese maintained control of those areas they would need to fully retreat from the Asian mainland. Ports, large cities, and major transportation links remained in Japanese control until they could be surrendered to Soviet and American forces. To counteract this imperial remnant, youth protection leagues formed in most parts of Korea, replacing any Korean piece of the Japanese colonial police force. Koreans knew that, no matter what happened, continued collaboration with the Japanese would not be beneficial moving forward. Korean members of the colonial police either quickly renounced their past, went into hiding, or fled with the Japanese. The work of the protection leagues was to replace the local police force and maintain peace until a more formal organization could be implemented, and they were largely successful. Koreans undeniably guilty of collaboration usually fled if they did not have the luxury of protection that money or connections afforded. Along with the protection leagues, which were mostly comprised of youth released from the labor duties imposed by GGK, former Korean soldiers and officers of the Imperial Japanese Army founded the National Preparatory Army under the CPKI. The NPA, as it was known, was another productive outlet for any revolutionary zeal that might have otherwise racked the country. Cummings reports that one official source places the NPA's enlistment at 60,000 within its first few weeks of existence. As I said before, the quick collapse of the colonial apparatus freed up a lot of time for a great many Koreans. The most successful and most lasting effort of CPKI was its efforts to organize the backbone of any mass movement: peasants, workers, women, and youth. The Japanese kept their promise to not interfere with organization efforts, and unions, mostly leftist, coalesced in the days and weeks after the surrender. They were mostly led by leftists because conservatives at the time did not believe in the power of mass movements, content to leave decision-making to haughty-toddy groups of well-dressed rich men discussing matters of state in smoky boardrooms. Persons of lower class were not members of a body politic, they were pests that needed to be controlled and neither seen nor heard. In line with this conflict between conservatives and non-conservatives, the more radical unions succeeded in taking control of their factories and ousting uncooperative owners. Like most things throughout history, though, there was a spectrum of union activities in Free Korea. Some unions and peasant coalitions were highly radical, forcing out ownership and taking control of capital, while others formed a more symbiotic relationship between worker and owner. There was no geographic pattern to how this played out, contrary to what one might expect given the impending division between capitalism and socialism. It really depended on the local situation and the beliefs of whoever was in charge of these diffuse groups. That simmering conflict between communist and non-communist, conservative and non-conservative, was happening all over the country, and CPKI was no different. Two groups dominated the committee: Yo and his non-communist allies, and the early nebula of the Korean Communist Party known as the Changgan Faction. The Changgan Faction, at this point, was led by older communists and was not yet influenced by the involvement of Korean communists who had spent much of their lives in China, Manchuria, or Russia. I think we'll talk about those groups next week. Some would charge that the presence of communists in the CPKI, which was split about evenly between communists and non-communists, allowed the committee to be dominated by communist ideals and goals. This was not true, as there was no formal structure to the communist faction like there was for the non-communist faction. Like I said, this was the nebula of a communist party, comprised entirely of those communists that had been in Seoul at the time of CPKI's foundation. Many more communists would be arriving in Korea as exiles returned from all over the world. After the first week or so of the committee's existence, reactionary forces lurched into motion. GGK expected the committee to be more compliant and not allow nearly as much revolutionary activity as had happened with the unions, protection leagues, and local committees. GGK, like Korean conservatives, hoped CPKI would only take on peacekeeping responsibilities and leave the task of governing to quote-unquote those that knew better. Between the 15th and 20th, Japanese sentiment turned decidedly against Yo and the CPKI that they had authorized, giving firearms to quote-unquote trustworthy Koreans and pressuring the committee to limit itself to peacekeeping activities. It was not difficult to see what would happen next, as Yo was attacked in Seoul on August 18th. This removed him from the immediate equation of power in Seoul as he recuperated in his country home for a few days. No one really knows who was responsible for the attack, as Yo faced criticism from all sides, but no matter who was responsible, it made cooperation increasingly difficult. It is a weird coincidence, though, that just 2 days later, prominent Korean conservatives attempted to convince CPKI to include more conservative members in the committee, even though Yo had already asked them multiple times to participate and was rebuffed each time. They also asked that CPKI renounce any claim to governmental legitimacy. While this maybe was not directed by Japanese officials, the timing was very funky. And what are the odds that it's another case of Korean conservatives inadvertently acting in line with the Japanese sentiment with no knowledge of that sentiment? The leadership of the committee sent a strong message to those reactionary forces on August 22nd, when it published a roster list of its members. The conservative entreaties for inclusion were soundly rejected, and most, if not all, named members were known for their anti-Japanese efforts. The gap between the sentiments of leftist and conservative Koreans grew wider, with the realization that the Soviets had stopped pushing down the peninsula and word arrived that the Americans were arriving at some point in the near future. When Soviet troops landed in Korea in mid-August, no one knew if they would stop before reaching Busan in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. It was not known for sure until August 17th, when the agreement on division was announced by MacArthur and when the Soviets landed in Korea and quickly moved to positions north of the 38th parallel. At this time, neither Korean nor Japanese officials knew when the Americans would arrive. Whenever that would be, though, they now had some spare time. The Japanese used this time to dole out some gifts to friendly Koreans in the form of weapons, land, machinery from their factories, basically anything that could not be loaded and taken back to Japan. They also printed 3 billion new yen, new currency notes, to circulate with the 5 billion already out and about. This torpedoed the local economy wherever this currency was accepted, all because the currency became worth increasingly less for each new yen put into circulation. To add insult to economic injury, the Japanese reached out to the Americans and began feeding them lines about the utter anarchy that was racking Korea. This, of course, was false, but the Americans didn't know that. This lowered Americans' trust of the CPKI and any future domestic Korean-led organizations before they even stepped foot on their transport ships to travel to Korea. Late in August, after administering mostly effectively for 2 weeks, CPKI declared that it was to begin setting up a new Korean government, with representatives elected by the people. Remember that, before annexation, Korea was ruled by an emperor, and before that, a long line of kings. Democracy in Korea was very much a new thing, even though democratic ideals had been held by some Koreans for a long time. The democracy coming to Korea had a big and, I think, understandable caveat. Anyone who collaborated with the Japanese was to be excluded from political activity in the new Korea. This was a popular sentiment in Korea at the time, especially considering that the Japanese misdeeds were still going on, even after they were beaten in the war and forced to leave Korea. 3 men were behind this declaration of intent: Yo, Ho Han, and Pak Han Yong. Yo and Ho were both moderate leftists, whose aim with this statement was probably to challenge the conservatives to push back against a free and representative government. Pak, though, is described by Cummings as the greatest leader of Korean communism at the time. That statement's backed up by the fact that, when Pak arrived in Seoul, he found a rival of his had already begun forming a new Korean Communist Party around the Changgan Faction. Pak poached most of the members of the party and organized his own reconstructed Korean Communist Party on September 8th. This unity of purpose between communists and moderates was remarkable, but not surprising given the radical attitude sweeping through the local committees and unions. The purpose of the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence was realized on September 6th with the proclamation of the Korean People's Republic. The expected arrival of the Americans was imminent, making the proclamation of paramount importance. No one really knows why it happened when it did, though. Anti-communists allege that the KPR was just a part of a larger communist plot to control all of Korea in spite of the impending division. This doesn't really hold up to the historical record, though, as Yo and Ho could hardly be called communists, and the final roster of the KPR's People Committee was a mix of conservatives, moderates, and communists. What probably happened is that such a proclamation in a vacuum was going to happen eventually. Because of the uncertainty of American plans, however, the timeline was bumped up a bit. Okay, it was bumped up a lot. Yo even admitted that the imminent arrival of the Americans pushed up their timetable for the proclamation of the KPR. That's why, on the 6th, a few hundred CPKI members arrived in Seoul and chose 87 new representatives for the Korean People's Republic. 55 were in the main People's Committee, 20 were in the Candidate Committee, and 12 were selected as advisors. These 87 men, and they were all men, are a veritable who's who of Korean political activists. There's guys we've already talked about, like Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung, and guys we'll talk about soon, like Kim Koo, Moo Chong, and Kim Kyu-sik. Even though cooperation and collaboration was achieved on the 6th, there were still important but uneven divisions within the new KPR leadership. Some weren't even in Korea. Their appointment was more symbolic until they could return from exile. A big age gap also existed between conservatives and non-conservatives. At the average age of 66, the former was 19 years older on average than the latter. There were a great many more non-conservatives, which I think represents the propensity for conservatives to collaborate with the Japanese if they didn't go into exile. If you were a moderate or communist Korean activist, you were much more likely to fight the Japanese or suffer in prison if exile was not a valid option. Now, I've said this before, but I want to say it again. The word nationalist is a common label for non-communist politicians in post-war Korea. That does not mean communists were not nationalists. Korean communism was especially nationalistic, and that was exacerbated by the inability of Comintern, the Soviet Union's international organization for spreading communism, by the inability of Comintern to make any meaningful connections with Korean communists on the peninsula. That is why I prefer to describe the domestic political factions in post-war Korea as conservatives and communists, with moderates lying in between on both sides of the spectrum. When I talk about moderates in league with one side over the other, I'll refer to the target group and the non- or anti-target group. Communist and non-communist, conservative and non-conservative. Cummings describes three main differences between the groups, focused on 1. The nature of the measures that needed to be taken to remove Japanese influence from Korea, 2. The necessity of widespread political organization, and 3. The destruction of the traditional Korean social and economic structures that existed before annexation. On September 8th, the People's Committee selected from its ranks the members of the First Cabinet as a largely symbolic gesture of Korean unity. If the KPR leadership roster is the who's who of Korean political activism, the list of cabinet members is the all-star team. On that list are Syngman Rhee as president, Ho Han as prime minister, Yo for vice chairman, Kim Sung-soo as minister of education, Kim Gu for interior, Kim Pyong-no for justice, Kim Kyu-sik for foreign affairs, Ha Pil-won for economics, Cho Man-sik for finance, and Sin Ik-wi for communications. Those that we haven't talked about yet will make their entrances, and sometimes exits, in due time. Although this cabinet leans to the left, it was constructed as a sign of good faith and unity towards conservatives in Korea. The feeling was not mutual. In the first week of its existence, the KPR worked to define its purpose and its goals. This was summed up in its September 14th declaration that, and I quote, "We are determined to demolish Japanese imperialism, its residuary influences, anti-democratic factions, reactionary elements, and any undesirable foreign influence in our state, and to establish our complete autonomy and independence. thereby anticipating the realization of an authentically democratic state. The declaration was published with a 27-point policy platform that accentuated the revolutionary aspirations of the KPR, emphasizing de-imperialization, defeudalization, industrial nationalization, land confiscation and socialization, increased civil rights, and enfranchisement and emancipation of women and other oppressed persons. This platform shows that the leadership of the KPR, at least the leadership that was present in Seoul, wanted to take the People's Republic from political revolution to social revolution. Internationally, the KPR wanted to establish strong ties with not just one great power, but with both the Soviets and Americans as well as with the British and Chinese. There are certainly some radical points on this platform, but by and large it is in line with a moderately socialist ideal for the process of decolonization. As the more revolutionary aspects of the KPR's platform began to sink into the minds of Korean conservatives, the counter-revolution began to form. In the first 2 weeks after the surrender of the Japanese on August 15th, organization among conservatives was poor, if it existed at all. The spark that lit the flame of conservative opposition to CPKI and eventually the KPR was the news that the United States was going to occupy the southern half of Korea. Almost simultaneously, different groups of conservative notables, including political activists, landowners, capitalists, and industrialists, met to form their own Korean Nationalist Party. These parties produced a joint declaration in opposition to the KPR on September 8th titled Down with the KPR, and on the 16th, united as the erroneously named Korean Democratic Party. The membership of the party was self-described as, quote, patriots, notables, and various circles of the intellectual stratum. A later American description was a bit more accurate. Members were, quote, predominantly large landowners and wealthy businessmen dressed well at meetings of the party of wealth and respectability, end quote. The more respectable members of the group were pushed to the front of the party to shield those members tainted with any whiff of collaboration. The levels of collaboration really run the gamut, from those dragged begrudgingly into cooperation with the Japanese, to those who gave speeches in support of the Japanese or took an active role in GGK's political and economic activities. All of this adds up to, as Cummings describes, a shortage of serious patriotic credibility relative to the leadership of the KPR. Like the KPR, the KDP formed a cabinet to further its claims to legitimacy. Like the KPR, this cabinet included respected elders, which is not surprising given the cultural emphasis placed on respect for elders by Koreans. Unlike the KPR, this cabinet was not a show of good faith or Korean unity. It included Syngman Rhee, Kim Koo, Song Jin-woo, Park Chon-wi, Yi Eun, and a bunch of other guys that aren't really important right now. I might get into them down the road, I just haven't figured that out yet. Remember how I said the feeling of cooperation between conservatives and non-conservatives was not mutual? Yeah, even though the KPR included a few notable conservatives in its leadership, there were not even any right-leaning moderates in the KDP leadership. The entirety of the KDP's mission was to oppose the KPR, and they didn't even put out a policy platform to offer the Korean people a different alternative. They just didn't like the KPR, and that was it. This is best seen in that Down with the KPR screed I mentioned earlier. In it, the KDP alleges that the KPR was gifted their legitimacy by the Japanese, that the KPR wanted to, quote, disturb the public order through treachery, and that the KDP's, quote, righteous sword would smash the evil through a great and noble undertaking. The KDP painted the KPR as agents of chaos, bent entirely on disrupting the natural order of Korean peace and prosperity by seizing the right to rule from those that truly deserved it. In the KDP's eyes, of course, those that rightfully deserved to rule were the noble elites who ruled Korea before annexation. It's clear the KDP's sole mission was to destroy and discredit the KPR. Its mechanisms for doing so involved constant attacks and publication of vague principles that held no actual water. The KDP did recognize the revolutionary spirit sweeping through Korea, but wanted to cut it off at the knees and direct it towards its own goals of maintaining the status of landowners, capitalists, and industrialists. It also exploited the perceived legitimacy of the Korean provisional government as a way of justifying its existence to both Koreans and Americans. Only there, with the incoming Americans, did any hope for the continued viability of the KDP exist. Genuine critiques of the KPR do exist. Because of a generally heightened propensity for reflection and criticism among leftists, the detailed critiques that do exist are almost entirely from the left. The KPR was pretty moderate, although it leaned heavily to the left in both the composition of its leadership and the substance of its platform. The speed with which it was proclaimed, though, meant that it was not able to mobilize any meaningful number of peasants or workers. That's kind of a big sticking point for communists. Because the KPR leadership did not have the time to engage in the modern politics of mass organization and mobilization, they were forced to turn back towards the traditional politics of elite networks and personal connections. They embraced that form of politics and turned much of their focus away from the rural provinces and towards the urban areas, Seoul chief among them. I want to point out, though, that the KDP did the exact same thing, not because of a lack of time, but because of a seemingly genuine disdain for the common person. There's also something to be said for the ability of the moderates to stick together as a set of personalities. Communists in Korea at this time were still pretty divided over petty personal differences. In the aftermath of decolonization, according to Cummings, they were engaged in, quote, rash power grabs, a free-for-all, and factionalism. There was still no Korean Communist Party that advocated effectively for Korean communism as a whole. Even for that, Korean communists seem more than willing to work within the KPR to achieve their political goals in cooperation with the moderates. Like many formerly Axis-controlled colonial states at the end of the Second World War, Koreans expected full recognition of their right to self-determination. Even though they were liberated from Japanese rule by foreigners, KPR leadership saw no reason that they should be placed back under the control of another set of foreigners. I think that's understandable. For the first time in a long time in Korea, there was hope. Hope that a turning point had finally been reached in Korean history. Since the 1870s, as we discussed in the first episode, Korea was the focal point of the political games of foreign powers. It's understandable that, after 3/4 of a century of being in the eye of a hurricane, Koreans would want something different. Before we end, let's talk about our friends Ri and Kim. Kim, if you remember, was a commander in the Red Army's 88th Brigade after exiling himself and his guerrillas to the Russian Far East. Contrary to the current North Korean story, Kim did not take part in any fighting between the Soviets and Japanese at the end of the war. His first attempt to get back to Korea also ended prematurely, as the main rail bridge between Manchuria and Korea was destroyed in the fighting. As you heard at the top of the episode, Kim finally arrived back in Korea in mid-August aboard the steamship Pugachev with a great many other Soviet soldiers and guerrillas. At this time, there were no plans for Kim to take a high-level leadership position in line with any Soviet commander. He, like many other Korean communists, was to be an assistant to a Soviet commandant as part of the occupation force, specifically as deputy commandant of the largest city in northern Korea, Pyongyang. Once again, fortune smiled on Kim Il-sung. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Ri began immediately trying to secure passage back to Korea from his exile in the United States. His initial passport was approved by the State Department, and he was granted a pass by MacArthur's Office of the Supreme Commander Allied Powers, or SCAP, SCAP, to return to Korea under the title of High Commissioner from Korea. Ri disliked the title as he did not want to draw attention to himself and his travel plans out of fear of being delayed by his enemies in China and Russia. Ri asked for a new passport without the title, which was issued. Then, the State Department decided to not assist Ri with further travel arrangements and asked him to request a pass from SCAP to specifically enter the war zone via the Army Air Corps. The Army would not wire this request without specific authorization by the State Department, who would not give authorization without assurances from SCAP. Ri would finally work himself out of this loop after a month of purgatory, which will place him back in Korea sometime during the next episode. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with the Soviets settling into northern Korea and the Americans about to arrive in southern Korea. Next week, we'll discuss the first few weeks of both occupations. If you're on social media, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.